Glen Stewart Godwin was born on the 26th of June 1958 in Miami, Florida and lived in Palm Springs, California in 1980. Around this year he had been self-employed as a tool salesman, construction worker, and a mechanic. Glen and his roommate, named Frank Soto, came up with a plan to rob someone who used to be their friend, Kim Robert LaValle, who was known as a drug dealer and a pilot. They went through with their plan by inviting Kim LaValle to their condominium. When they were all there, Frank Soto held Robert while Glen proceeded to punch, kick, and strangle him. After this, Glen stabbed Robert 26 times. Once they were finished, they took his body to the desert and used home-made explosives to blow up the body as they wanted to disguise the murder. By the 3rd of August 1980, human remains were found in an abandoned truck that had been blown up in the desert. Glen was later charged with first-degree murder and sentenced to 26 years to life in 1983, and Frank Soto received 25 years to life in 1982. In 1987, Glen was moved to a maximum security prison after a failed prison escape attempt. While there, a hacksaw had been smuggled in, which Glen used to cut a hole through fence wire, escaping into a storm drain that led into the American River. He was then able to flee to Mexico. Later, he was arrested in Puerto Vallarta for drug trafficking and was sentenced to 7 years and 6 months in 1991. As Mexican authorities were working on extraditing Glen back to the United States, he allegedly killed a member of a Mexican drug cartel in prison, which delayed his extradition. This gave him the chance to escape in September 1991. It is believed that he is involved in the drug trade somewhere in Latin America and is considered armed and dangerous. The FBI are offering up to $20,000 for information that leads to his arrest. Born in 1953, Vernon Henry was married to Connie Marie Henry. Connie had been going through severe domestic violence from her husband, Vernon. Connie and their children were continuously subject to Vernon's physical and verbal abuse. In August of 1996, during an argument, Connie said she had had enough of his violence and threatened to leave Vernon. Their eldest daughter had just come home after spending the night with her boyfriend. Around 5 minutes later, Vernon walked over to the closet, picked up a pistol or a revolver and shot and killed Connie and their eldest daughter. According to their younger sons, he then fled the scene in his 1986 Toyota Camry 4-door vehicle. Richard Lynn Bear was born on the 6th of July 1964. Sherry Lyle Hart was last seen alive on the 14th of January, 1984. She was 24 years old and had just moved herself and her daughter in with her parents. That night, Sherry had gone out on a date to a restaurant, but her date never turned up. After that, Sherry never returned home. After a few days, her parents reported her missing and her dad found her car in the parking lot of the restaurant. 11 months later, on the 10th of December 1984, police were investigating an unrelated case and had been led to the bottom of a 2,000-foot cliff near to North Carolina Highway 16. At the base, investigators located a decomposing body. It was later identified as Sherry's. A witness had last seen Sherry with 2 men, Jeffrey Scott Burgess and Richard Lynn Bear. When they were interrogated, Richard claimed they had dropped Sherry back to her car around 9 p.m. Jeffrey Burgess later admitted to what happened. Jeffrey said that on that night, they both picked up Sherry and all 3 had driven around in Richard's white Ford Mustang and had told Sherry they would all be going to a party. During their drive, Sherry had asked if they could stop briefly. She then went into the woods to urinate. She was walking back to the car when Richard walked up to her, grabbed her, and tried to kiss her. Sherry continuously denied his advances, but he kept a hold on her as he tried. She then got free and ran to the car, begging Jeffrey Burgess to help her. Richard then came behind her and struck her in the head with his shotgun, then forcing her into the car. Richard got Jeffrey to drive them all to a place on Highway 16. Sherry was bleeding heavily as Richard forced her out of the car. He then told Burgess to drive down the road. Richard then dragged Sherry to the top of the cliff and pushed her off of it. Burgess drove back to Richard after a few minutes, and they both drove away. On the 1st of April 1985, they were both arrested and charged with Sherry's murder. 4 months later, on the 17th of July 1985, Richard managed to escape the Wilkes County Jail. The jailer accidentally left his cell door open during visiting hours and Richard left as the jailer's back was turned, escaping through the front door. The jailer was fired afterwards. Because of his escape, Burgess was released on bail pending Richard's capture. In 1993, Richard was nearly captured by FBI at the residence of a relative in Delaware, but he had fled before FBI agents got to the residence. Burgess never went to trial and only served 4 months for violating probation in an unrelated case, was in and out of jail for various drug offenses before dying in 2012. Richard Lynn Bear had ties to South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia and Florida and may disguise himself as a woman, and it has been claimed he was wearing disguises when visiting the funerals of some of his relatives.